So good evening, everybody. I am really pleased to be the moderator for this program. And I would like to thank everybody for coming here tonight. This is, in my belief, is going to be a really, really informative program on the reality and the future of technology and how it plays into the transportation industry for automobiles. Before I go into the program, and I keep on trying to remind myself that staying on time is important because it's who these people are that you want to hear from, it's not me. So I now want to move on to what we're going to do tonight and then turn this over to the esteemed group of panelists. And you've probably read the blurb, but what we're going to talk about here is what the automotive industry is likely to respond to as there are production mandates for zero-emission vehicles as far as the ability to minimize the carbon footprint, both from a perspective of efficiency and also from a perspective of just keeping things as clean as possible. So the kinds of topics that we're going to be addressing have to do with not just the technology forcing functions and opportunities within a complex regulatory environment, but also what are the potential new vehicle technologies that are out there? What's the ability of different fueling methodologies in order to address that, whether it's current petrochemicals that as you know, we're looking at higher and higher gas mileage requirements in the regulatory environment, all the way to vehicle electrification and batteries, new batteries, and the use of hydrogen. And finally, last but not least, what's really important is to have an infrastructure so that you can utilize some of these advanced technologies. Certainly doesn't help you much if there are no gasoline stations where you are. And you have a car that's running on gasoline or diesel. So you actually have to have a structure where that provides the ability to produce those fuels as well as enable people to fuel up. So we have three experts sitting to my left. The first one is David Rainey. David is the founder and president of Rainey Associates. It's an environmental and energy policy consulting firm that's based in Santa Barbara itself. David has 30 years of experience with a large number of firms. He started off with Deere & Company. He was with Saab, General Motors, and finally ending up as an executive with Honda in its headquarters in Torrance, California. David has a tremendous experience in environmental leadership, product stewardship, and corporate sustainability. And he really understands the safety and environmental space, and you'll hear a lot of that when he talks tonight. He's currently an adjunct professor at UC Santa Barbara's Bren Graduate School, and he obtained his Bachelor's of Science in Mechanical Engineering from the University of Oklahoma and an executive MBA from UCLA's Anderson School of Business. Tyson Eckerly, the next individual, is currently the Executive Director of Energy Independence Now, and he works with members of the environmental community, state agencies, legislative decision makers, automakers, and fuel providers to develop the priorities and projects necessary to decrease the petroleum footprint as transportation evolves. Over the past year, Tyson has become preeminent with the California Fuel Cell Partnership, and he is actually trying to help that organization commercialize hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles. He's also a treasurer on the board of directors for the California Hydrogen Business Council. Tyson holds a BA in biology from UC California, Davis, and a master's in environmental science and management from the Bren School and at UCSB. And finally, but not least, Ichiro Sugioka. He's the science officer at Volvo's Monitoring and Concept Center in Camarillo, California. He oversees the strategic planning and scientific support of new automobile propulsion concepts. The VMCC, which is the acronym for that organization, has been the birthplace of numerous Volvo concepts, such as the environmental concept car. It's a plug-in hybrid, the safety concept car, and finally a 3-seat concept car that you may have seen in any of the Volvo ads. They also support the production and design of commercial vehicles as well. So Ichiro has a pretty interesting history as well. While he does have a degree from MIT, and that was, I guess, his master's degree in aeronautical engineering, he comes from another place that I'm very familiar with, and that's a little place called Caltech. So he has an honors degree, a bachelor's of science from Caltech, and his PhD from Caltech as well. He's spent a good part of his career in the design of wind tunnels at Caltech, and I welcome all 3 speakers, and I think you're going to hear a really wonderful program. So, David?
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you for to the Enterprise Forum for having us tonight in this program. I thank my fellow panelists. We hope it's an informing evening. My goal is to get off the podium as fast as I can, turn it over to these 2 guys that are much smarter than me, and hopefully leave us 35 minutes of Q&A. Hopefully we stimulate a lot of questions, and the presentation material just gets us started. Before we get going, I just want to recognize, is James Provenzano in the room? James, could you stand up a minute? Just thank you particularly. He brought his Honda Clarity up, Honda's fuel cell vehicle up from Los Angeles tonight. So if you haven't seen it, take a look at it out there. It's a beautiful car, and James will probably stick around a little bit afterwards and answer any questions there. But after the event, obviously. Henry Dubroff, good to see you here tonight as always. I see some young people. It's always nice to see at the forum young people here. How many students do we have in the room? Raise your hand. Thank you for coming. It's really encouraging to see you taking advantage of what the forum offers. Again, I've got, believe it or not, 40 slides to run through here, but I'm going to do this very quickly. It's a rapid-fire approach of bringing you up to speed on where we've been in the motor vehicle realm, dating back actually to the 1940s. A lot of what you are going to see tonight, you may not have read in the newspapers. You may have even not known about that it was going on, or even forgotten about it if you did know. I think one of the themes of my presentation is what you read in the newspapers is not exactly what happened. You've heard the old adage of there's 2 things you don't want to see being made in Washington. That's laws in Congress and sausage. A lot of what's gone on behind the scenes in the past 10 years has been very political in nature. California has been involved intimately, but if you weren't watching the newspapers 3 weeks ago, the United States government out of the Obama administration actually finalized the most stringent standards the auto industry has ever seen in its history. So we'll talk about that a bit tonight. But the politics leading up to that is quite an interesting story. Maybe in my latter years I'll write a book on that as well. But can we have the first slide? We've made a lot of progress in the history of the industry. This is a lot of stuff that happened pre-regulation days. In the years prior to the 1960s, when the US EPA was first established, it was just about anything goes in terms of what you wanted to put on a car or build it, and it runs from safety standards as well as the emission control systems. Next slide, please. Most of the consumer demands are always tried to be met, and that's the case of today. But sometimes manufacturers are successful, and sometimes they're not. Next slide. This is a picture of the vehicle out in front. We have come a long ways in terms of technology horizon since the slides I first showed you. But the vehicle on the top is the Honda Clarity. You probably will be seeing a lot more fuel cell hydrogen vehicles on the road in the next 3 to 4 years. Tyson's going to be talking to that. The vehicle on the bottom is the Nissan Leaf, if you haven't seen that. Purely battery electric car, plug-in electric. It's got about a 700-pound battery pack mounted midstream in the vehicle. And it's a lithium-ion battery, which frankly today is quite expensive. The range of price that you've probably heard in the battery pack for this vehicle is upwards of $14,000 to replace right now. So it's a pretty sizable portion of the vehicle cost. Next slide. We're going to talk tonight about fuel economy. We've transitioned from the period of time when you probably struggled to even stay outdoors in the 1948 time period and later when photochemical smog first started to become prevalent in people's conversation down in Los Angeles. I've heard scientists say that if we hadn't finally understood the mechanisms of formation of smog, you literally couldn't live in the basin today, I think, which is probably true. But it took almost 20 years for people to understand the science behind the formation of photochemical smog up to the point of finally getting the auto industry and the petroleum industry to finally admit to the fact that what was coming out of their factories and their tailpipes were the precursors for the air quality problems. We lived through that for many years, but in parallel with trying to control tailpipe precursor emissions, in 1975 the first fuel economy standards were actually adopted by the United States Congress. They set standards that took effect in 1978 and are still in place, frankly. But some interesting milestones happened. As soon as they were adopted, you had almost a 50% increase in the price of fuel. So there was a stimulus actually in the market to get people interested in smaller cars. Detroit struggled to make them, but this actually was the boon for what you saw in terms of the increase in market share coming in from the Asian manufacturers. Honda and Toyota actually saw the light and the need to actually build vehicles here, so they started producing factories as well. You had a significant increase initially in the fuel economy of both cars and light trucks. An interesting point back in the 1978 and pre-1988 timeframe is the penetration of trucks and vans in the market was very small. Today it's about 50%, but in those days it was less than 20. So we went along in a 1984-85 timeframe, and what happened, you saw a 100% decrease in the price of fuel. So it started us off on a pathway of actually stagnation, of people not only being not interested that much in fuel economy and the vehicles, but it also stagnated the standards. So they stayed around 27.5 miles per gallon for the motor vehicle you see in the red line, particularly the car. And truck standards obviously were lower due to significant lobbying from the Detroit automakers. In the later years, starting back in 2004, you started to see a significant increase in the price of gasoline as well. So what happened, you also saw some response in customer preference for more fuel-efficient vehicles. So this takes us up to the 2009 period, and we'll start talking about the future in a second. Next slide. You can see a lot of what's happened to motor vehicles since 1975. First, the average vehicle weight took a significant drop from 1975 to 1987, a significant downturn. But it's come back up to almost where it was back in 1975. Horsepower has increased significantly. And you've seen a significant increase in four-cylinder engines to meet the fuel economy demand. But look what's happened to the V8. Most of the V8s today are typically in SUVs and large trucks, but you've gone from 62% down to 16% in 2011. You're going to see a significant increase, as you've already started to see, in gasoline direct injection, stoichiometric GDI. Turbocharging is going to start to become more prevalent, along with higher speeds with more optimized fuel economy ratios and 6- and 7-speed transmissions. And you're going to see a tremendous increase in the market prevalence of hybrid electric vehicles in the next 5 to 10 years. Next slide. This is just a shot of where we have grown in terms of the truck volume. I won't spend much time on this. I made the point. But interestingly enough, in the most recent fuel economy standards that hit the streets 3 weeks ago, the US EPA is not projecting that much of a decrease in truck volume in the market penetration up until 2025. So next slide. One interesting point is that the cost of driving is still relatively low compared to what it was certainly back in 1985 as well as 1975. So compared to other parts of the world, I think for a gallon of gas in Norway today, I think you're paying upwards of $9 a gallon. In Italy, I think you're paying upwards of probably $7 a gallon. In the UK, it's about $8 a gallon. So we still haven't used the price point of fuel, I think, to get the customer's attention and use that as a driver and it is a significant influence. Next slide. This is a pictorial or a graphic depiction of what I showed you in the chart earlier. There is what I called masked fuel efficiency in cars today. You've seen a tremendous increase in weight. You've seen a tremendous increase in horsepower, which leads to a boon in 0 to 60 time. But yet the fuel efficiency of the fleet has remained pretty much the same. So there is tremendous fuel efficiency pent up in vehicles today waiting to be capitalized, and we'll talk about some of the technology that can get at that later in terms of mass reduction, better use of high-speed computers that can crash vehicles on a computer as opposed to running a full prototype mock-up into a wall at 35 miles an hour, as well as better use of materials, design, and optimized use of transmissions, as well as the overall powertrain. The next slide. This picture tells 1,000 words, essentially. The last presentation that we had at the forum showed a comparison of a battery and a gasoline can, showing the difference in density between battery and a gallon of gasoline today. This is just another pictorial of that, but it tells you what a designer is up against in terms of trying to move a mass of 3,000 pounds down the road. The key for a battery is to get as much energy density into it as you possibly can, which is why the trend today is towards lithium-ion. We started off with lead, nickel metal hydride, and lithium-ion. But the reason you're not seeing more range in an electric vehicle today, such as the Leaf, which can, on a charge, get between 70 and maybe 90 miles on a charge if you're lucky, is because of the cost. Lithium-ion is still very expensive compared to nickel metal hydride. So while the energy density potential is there, we're just not able to see the benefit of that yet in terms of keeping the car affordable. On the other hand, you see where hydrogen comes in terms of the gravimetric energy density. And the challenge is getting a lot of it onto the vehicle. The big debate today, which Tyson will be talking about, is how much pressure and what size of a tank and what storage medium do we have on the vehicle. The car that James drove up today has a fairly large tank. It's a charge of 5,000 psi on the average. The challenge today is talking about going up to 10,000 psi, which can increase the range of these vehicles considerably. Next slide. One of the things that you're going to see as well, and the EPA actually figured this into their program, is a tremendous benefit from mass reduction. We're looking at anywhere upwards of 10 to 15% of mass reduction. But why don't you go to the next slide? I don't want to spend much time on this, but taking a transition now into the history and where we've been, the United States, frankly, has been lagging the rest of the world, believe it or not, in trying to go at CO2 emissions and fuel economy standards for the past many years. I think we can owe it to our elected officials and appointed officials in the state of California that has essentially stimulated the federal government to move to the point where they are today. AB 32 really has been a stimulus, not only to the auto industry, but it's been a stimulus to the federal government to act. And we are at the point today with new standards that are proposed upwards moving into 2025 of actually getting in line with the rest of the world, which has some of the most stringent CO2 standards now in the automotive history realm. The next slide. This is an image of what happened 3 weeks ago. As we talked about earlier, CAFE standards had stagnated for cars at about 27.5 miles per gallon. They were at 22.5 miles per gallon for light trucks for many years. There was a bump up. And it wasn't until the 2008-9 timeframe when the state of California began to propose their own CO2 standards that essentially sent some shockwaves through Detroit and woke them up and to the point of actually agreeing to new standards from the federal government. So it was the state of California and the California Resources Board that actually started this. You may recall that the auto industry was in litigation in I think there were 5 venues, 5 courts, separate courts that the auto industry was tied up in, trying to block the state of California from adopting CO2 standards. And the Obama administration brought the auto industry and California to the table. auto industry agreed to back off the litigation. California agreed to back off on adopting their own regulations. So the federal government recaptured the authority. But what has happened is, again, to continue to kind of keep California at bay, is the auto industry has had to agree to standards that they never would have dreamed of agreeing to 5 or 10 years ago. So it's been a very interesting political process, and the targets that have been proposed are shown here, and actually in CO2 numbers, the target in 2025 is 54.5 miles per gallon. It's a two-pronged standard in the sense that EPA cannot regulate fuel economy. They can regulate CO2. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, DOT, the people that have managed the standards for all these years, can manage CAFE or fuel economy. So you've got two standards. The CAFE standard under NHTSA, NHTSA, is actually 49.6. That's their target. But it's still pretty significant in terms of where the auto industry has to be. The only reason that the auto industry, I think, agreed to this was they were able to convince the Obama administration, recognizing the long-term forecast of these new standards, is they put a midterm review into play, which will occur in 2018. And there's a whole litany of issues that the government will have to consider. When the midterm review happens, it'll actually start in the 2016 timeframe. Probably the National Academy of Sciences will be heavily involved, but there's the economic progress of the vehicles that have been put forth so far to try to meet the initial phase of these standards, which are already taking effect. The dotted lines show what was adopted three weeks ago, but those are the post-2017 standards. The review will take a look at the success of technology, the cost of technology, the economy, the state of the economy at large, the employment base, and they'll look at the actual labor market. Do we have unemployment that is still at where we are today, and we can't afford to hold the auto industry to this anymore because they're not selling the cars. So 2018 is a critical time frame to watch your newspapers again to see if the rules are going to be changed or if they'll be held constant by the federal government. Just to put you in context here, what the California Air Resources Board wanted when they went to the federal government, they proposed 62 miles per gallon. And the auto industry was able to convince the Obama administration to get down to the level that they are right now. So next slide, please. This is a little bit of the form of the standard. It's very unique. In the past, the auto industry essentially had one number to deal with, 27.5 miles per gallon. You had cars higher than that and cars lower, and you averaged them all together, and you came up with a certain number to meet the standard. It's changed a little bit in the sense that now we have what's called a footprint-based standard. It's a little bit of a complex chart to try to explain in a small presentation here, but essentially, you have the smaller cars shown on the left side of the screen. This is just the car-only model, but they have to meet a higher standard, essentially, than trucks do, which or larger cars, which are on the right end of the screen. Now, if a manufacturer only builds cars that are in the smaller footprint area, you can see that they kind of get the raw end of the deal here. So it pays manufacturers to have a broad fleet. Frankly, a lot of people have complained that this favors only the large manufacturers based in Detroit. When the Obama administration asked the auto industry to come to the White House and sign the agreement that they would all support the new fuel economy standards, there are two members of the auto industry that didn't come, Volkswagen and Mercedes, and you can read their statements filed on the federal docket, and they were very vociferous in their remarks that they think this is just a giveaway to the Detroit automakers. Some people would probably agree with that. Next slide, please. This is the technology base that the NHTSA and EPA and the California Resources Board have considered. This actually comes out of the National Academy of Sciences, but it's the same technology grouping. And sophisticated modeling was where this was input into, if you will, along with their own sales forecasting of where we see small cars and mid cars and large cars and trucks ending up in terms of the market share in 2025. You can't read this, obviously, I apologize, but it's a whole litany of new technologies, and they all have their own individual cost attachments to them, and some of them are very expensive. But they're looking at such things as downsizing engines from 8-cylinder to 6-cylinder, 6-cylinder to inline 4, adding turbocharging to those engines and putting gasoline direct injection technology into them. Looking at 6- and 7-speed and 8-speed transmissions. I know that we're even going to be seeing 9- and 10-speed transmissions with very sophisticated gear ratioing and electronic controls in that time. They're looking at even the simplest things, such as low friction lubes, low rolling resistance tires, and again, they've gone through and put all of their own fuel economy benefit attachments to those. So the real challenge is a question of cost. It's a question of how fast you can get this to the market and how adaptable will consumers be to them. Sometimes customers are a little bit reticent to get into new technology. So it's the rate of penetration, I think, that probably has some of the biggest challenge for the auto industry. We'll talk about that a little bit here as well. Next slide. Sometimes even the most simple technology can take upwards of 5, 10, and 15, and even 20 years once it's introduced on a small part of the fleet to get into 100% of the product line. Speaking from experience, the Acura NSX, when it was introduced back in 1988, it had Honda's first application of what was called VTEC. It was a variable valve timing technology. And it wasn't until the 2001 Civic that VTEC hit 100% of Honda's fleet. Here's a tremendous technology that is applicable for both performance as well as fuel economy potential. It's an engineer's dream, but it just doesn't happen overnight. Manufacturers have product plans. They'll phase out one model and put the new technology in, and the next model will, when it has its 5-year life up, they'll bring the technology in. So this is one of the challenges that the government has to deal with. You can't just bring new technology in overnight and expect it to hit the entire fleet. So 2025 seems like a long time away, but in engineering terms, from the product planner side, it's tomorrow. Next slide. Here are some of the things I mentioned earlier that the midterm review is going to have to look at. Again, availability and effectiveness of technology, cost on the producers, the feasibility and practicality, a whole litany of things that the auto industry, again, and their lobbyists on K Street are already gearing up to go after. Next slide. Manufacturers do have an option. You don't comply, you pay a fine. The only manufacturers that have not paid a fine since the inception of CAFE standards are General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. The Japanese companies have not. General Motors says that their board will not allow them to pay a fine because it's symbolic of breaking the law in this country. But Daimler Chrysler just says it's part of doing business. So in 2006, they wrote the Treasury Department a check for $30,257,000. So these are when the standards are 27.5 miles per gallon. What happens when they hit 40 miles per gallon? What will the fees be? So next slide. Let me transition to California, and I'm going to hurry up to get off the podium here and turn it over to Tyson. But in March of this year, the state of California revised its electric vehicle mandate for the 7th time. They adopted their EV mandate as part of the low-emission vehicle program in 1990. Electric vehicles, essentially the addition to the program at that time, was an afterthought. Nobody knew how to build one, and the fact that General Motors had showed up with the Impact, their first prototype of an electric car, a year earlier at the LA Auto Show, it gave Air Resources Board kind of some feeling that, wow, this might actually happen, with General Motors thinking about it. But I think everybody knows we had the film Who Killed the Electric Car. It didn't happen. Nissan is struggling as we speak. Their target this year was to sell 20,000 Leafs. I think they're at about 3,600 right now this year. The Volt is doing fairly well with the plug-in. I think they're at about 11,000 vehicles, but still under capacity. But Air Resources Board is staying with it. And the mandate has not gone away, probably will not go away. But what they did in March was extend it beyond 2016 and have taken us up to 2025 now in terms of the projections. They've given manufacturers what they deem to be tremendous flexibility in terms of complying, but it still is a very, very challenging concept when you look at the number of vehicles that they're looking at having on the road. For instance, taking us way forward, they're looking at a projection of maybe 1.4, 1.5 million electric vehicles on the road in 2025. So we've got a lot to do to get there. This is the credit scheme. It's a very, very simplified chart, and I thank Tyson for putting this together. But the bottom line is a manufacturer has a choice. You can either build a ton of 10-mile plug-in hybrid vehicles and get 0.4 credits to offset one electric vehicle. So you'd need to build 2 point whatever of those to meet one electric vehicle credit. Alternatively, you could build one fuel cell vehicle and get 4 credits. So there are a lot of options. The challenge again is cost and driving range, and the race is on. I think the next 10 years are going to be absolutely phenomenal to watch in terms of what the auto industry is going to produce. Say what you want about the California mandate. It has got some teeth in it, and it is continually pushing technology. So next slide. This is just an example of the credit scheme. I won't spend much time on this. Next slide, Aaron. Here's some sales that I mentioned to date. So far, we've got about a little less than 14,000 Nissan Leafs in total since they were launched, and the Chevy Volts about 22,000 nationwide. Next slide. One thing that I think I would like to commend the US EPA on is they're finally starting to, I think, get with the program. They're recognizing, I think, what has been happening around the rest of the world, in Canada, Europe, where people have adopted a different metric for advertising fuel economy. We're hooked on miles per gallon. It's the amount you drive. My opinion is that's not really what matters. It's what's coming out of the tailpipe or what you're consuming inside the combustion chamber. So I think that the European method, the Canadian method, is the right one, and that's fuel consumption. In other words, gallons per, say, 100 miles or 100 kilometers as opposed to miles per gallon. There's a very interesting point about this slide, though. If you look at the rectangular boxes and the number just to the right to them, out to the right when you look at very high fuel economy vehicles, the gallons saved for 10,000 miles of going from a 40 to an 80 mile per gallon car is only 125 gallons. But if you get somebody from a vehicle that gets, say, 10 miles and move them into a vehicle that gets 20 miles per gallon, they'll save 500 gallons for every 10,000 miles they drive. So I think there's some real means to the madness there. EPA is finally, I think, contemplating actually changing the label and the metric. I hope we see it in the next 5 to 10 years, but it gets people's attention, I think, in a lot more ways to maybe not be so stubborn about getting out of one of their very large vehicles and moving just one class up. It does make a huge difference. Next slide. So what's on the radar? Midterm evaluation in the 2017 to 2018 timeframe of the Federal CAFE program. You'll have the ZEV market and the CARB regulation in the post-2012, and it probably is going to have to be revised again sometime, maybe 2014 or 15. And they probably still won't get it right, but they keep trying, which is good. We'll have to really pay attention to market success of new technologies. Certainly, higher penetration of hybrids are on the horizon. You're going to see a tremendous new market for these vehicles. Diesel still questionable because of the cost of the after treatment and low emission standards that they have to face. And then the higher cost of compact vehicles. Ford is doing a very interesting experience with loading up, for instance, the Focus, really getting the noise vehicle vibration and handling characteristics down on the vehicle, but loading it up with technology and customer convenience features, and they're pricing the car accordingly. It's kind of a market experience. But then you have the hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, which, frankly, I think the majority of the auto industry will tell you it is the holy grail. And the Air Resources Board will tell you the same thing. So we're going to hear some tonight on the continued expansion of infrastructure support for advanced vehicles. And there's also some considerations for how to measure real-world fuel economy to get at this in a more realistic way. I will tell you that I regret that I have to run out of here at 8 o'clock tonight to go down to LAX and catch a red-eye flight to Detroit. But this will hopefully be on the website, and I'll leave some business cards here if you have any questions. So, Tyson, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much, David. Very, very informative presentation, and I've just noticed this view is much better with the ocean out there. So anyhow, my name's Tyson Eckerly. I'm Executive Director of Energy Independence Now, and we focus on transportation policy and trying to move beyond fossil fuels and petroleum. And so we advocate heavily for a portfolio of solutions, battery electric vehicles, plug-in hybrids, and also hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles. And that's what I'm going to focus on today, because that's where I've been doing the most work as of late. So we can go to the next slide, it'd be great. So I'm going to give a little bit of a background about hydrogen and fuel cell vehicles, and then outline some opportunities for entrepreneurs to get involved. And so some of them are are pie in the sky, but where I think we can still grab a piece and eat it. And some are really on the ground, nuts and bolts, and needing help today. And so, first of all, what's a fuel cell electric vehicle? Some of you saw it out front. There's the Honda Clarity is a perfect example that James brought up. But what it does, it stores high-pressure hydrogen in a tank there up on the top, and that hydrogen is run through a fuel cell. And that fuel cell, what it does is dissociates the electrons from the hydrogen when it meets the anode. It takes those electrons, put it around, and creates an electric current, and then it recombines in the cathode site with oxygen from the air to create water vapor at the end. So basically you have an electric current that is driving an electric motor, so that's why it's an electric vehicle. So one of the appeals of this is it's a very efficient process. Compared to combustion, you can see on the graph there on the right, a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle is 2 to 3 times as efficient on an energy basis. So this is a picture of the Honda Clarity kind of underneath the belly out there. So just kind of show you that the tank is in the back, the fuel cell is in between the driver and the passenger, and then there's an electric drive motor in the front. So why do we care about fuel cells? Well, I really got interested because of California's big challenge, and we have a large vehicle problem. And so SUVs and trucks make up about less than half of the population of vehicles in California, but they account for much more than half of the emissions. And so you can see here NOx, the red pie slice represents emissions from SUVs and trucks, their share compared to passenger vehicles, and then on the other side is greenhouse gas emissions. So if we really need to address large vehicles if we really want to address or reduce emissions. Okay, go to the next slide. So this is where fuel cell vehicles come in. This is a vehicle technology map that has been adopted by the California Fuel Cell Partnership, and it's based on input from General Motors and Toyota. And so you can see the vertical axis is vehicle size, and then the horizontal one is driving distance. And the way that these companies see the world is a battery electric vehicle is perfect for smaller vehicles that drive shorter distances. And then moving your way up, you can capture more of the miles by going to a plug-in hybrid version. So you have some zero-emission vehicle miles based on plug-in, and the rest is done with internal combustion, either with biofuels or gasoline. Then the fuel cell vehicle can scale up all the way to heavy-duty trucks. So you can get passenger vehicles, heavy-duty trucks, and that's why it's kind of considered the holy grail of transportation. So you can address those emissions with a fuel cell vehicle. So this is a graph that's put together by the Department of Energy. And what I want to point out about it is, so on today's mid-size SUV, we have about 600 grams of CO2 per mile. That's at the very top. You can look down at the bottom, you see the battery electric vehicles and fuel cell electric vehicles. We can cut that significantly. It's a similar story for criteria pollutants like NOx and stuff. So we can go to the next slide. So fuel cell vehicles, as you see out there, are actually ready to be a prime family vehicle. That's part of the greatest appeal of them. They have quick fuel up, long range. They can be scaled up to all vehicle classes from small compact vehicles all the way up to Class 8 trucks. The personal garage is not necessary, so for people living in multi-dwelling units or apartment buildings, you could own a zero-emission vehicle and fill up at a local fueling station. So what's the opportunity? Just a few weeks ago, they had the Global Industry Analysts Incorporated came out with a study and showed that hydrogen production and storage capabilities are projected to reach $1.4 billion by 2018 in value. And that's just looking at storage and production. So what I wanted to talk about is how we can get a slice of that pie as an entrepreneur and join in there. So I'll get into these bullet points so much better as we go on. So we can go to the next slide. So there's substantial momentum behind the industry. Automakers have already invested billions of dollars in the technology. And as David said, you don't read it all about in the newspapers. You haven't heard a lot about hydrogen and fuel cell vehicles. And even without the press, the automakers have been pouring money into this. The industry has met or exceeded almost all Department of Energy targets. And that's a really critical factor. So the technology hurdles have been overcome. Now it's just about getting to scale, and it's really a business problem, business issue to get these vehicles out here, and that's why we're here today. And you can see that Germany, Japan, Korea, the UK, Norway, Sweden, and California are all investing heavily in getting infrastructure in the ground. So there are many opportunities to plug in and help push this market. Okay, so California, what's interesting here is it's the only place in the world where all of the major automakers are actively engaged. The California Fuel Cell Partnership, which I'm a member of, has come up with this California roadmap. And they actually just finished it up this summer. And what they've done is figured out, okay, what's the minimum number of stations we need in California to help build a credible market? It turns out that number is about 68 stations. And so what 68 stations represents is a 6-minute drive time for a car owner in most of the metropolitan areas in California. So they're focusing where the circles are in the Bay Area and Southern California with some connectors. And the key one that we want to look at tonight, just to point out, is Santa Barbara. It's key on that map. And James will attest to that it's will help open up the market. And so it's all about getting enough coverage so that somebody owning a fuel cell vehicle can go to the places that they would like to go. Okay. So this is just a snapshot of who's behind the plan. You have auto companies, gas providers, government. And here's a slide that shows kind of the automakers that are preparing for a commercial launch. So where the target date is 2015, really, for the early commercial push. So Daimler, Nissan, Toyota, Honda, Hyundai, and General Motors are all working diligently with different plans to release their fuel cell vehicles. Along the bottom line, you can see these vehicles are scaled up from compacts all the way to SUVs and buses. So to indicate the potential of fuel cell vehicles in the marketplace, we can look at the hybrid experience. So the top graph shows the hybrids on a nationwide basis. So you can see the Toyota Prius is the largest slice, and then as more and more hybrids got introduced, that market share that cumulatively goes up, and there's more and more hybrids on the road. Same thing could happen with the fuel cells. They're projecting about 52,000 vehicles in California by 2017, sorry. And if we continued at half the hybrid growth experience, that would be 180,000 vehicles on the road by 2025. And so I'm kind of on the other side of David, saying maybe optimistic. So who's going to be buying these cars besides James? My friends. Yeah, James's friends. One of the appeals, it appeals to all vehicle segments. We're expecting early adopters to be mostly interested at first. These people are probably environmentally conscious. They don't want compromise on range or performance. Or they could also, there's a term called technophile, so someone who wants the kind of latest and greatest. Whoever has an iPhone 5 in the audience or has an order in, we would like to talk to you. Or I know people who would like to. And the target price is about $50,000. There haven't been any official statements yet, but so we're kind of in the luxury market, but accessible to the general public. And the appeal is, in 10 or 15 years down the road, that fuel cell vehicles will be able to compete on cost with internal combustion engines. Okay, go to the next. So here's I want to get into the opportunities for an entrepreneur. So the kind of big one is you could become the Tesla of fuel cell electric vehicles. And that's a picture of the Tesla Model X, which is an amazing battery electric car, which combines an SUV with the benefits of a minivan as their marketing slogan. The difference here is, the Model X has a 267-mile range, and you have to recharge overnight, essentially. Whereas a fuel cell vehicle, you could get in 350-mile range and recharge in 5 minutes. And so that's one of the things you can get the next. So you could package, if you wanted to become the Tesla fuel cell vehicles, you could package some ideas around that. One of the things we've kicked around is the fuel cell vehicle club. And so where you would, and today actually, if you're leasing a Honda Clarity, fuel is included in the lease, but you could build that out into the future where you have a more stable fuel price that's built into your lease, and you could create a club type of concept where your fuel is included on a monthly basis. You could make it kind of a status symbol type thing, and you could also use some of that lease price money to build out infrastructure in the future so people take ownership into it. You could provide transportation as a service. One of the appealing things of hydrogen is it has a more predictable cost, and so there's not the volatility in the oil prices. Advanced technology car share programs, you can like Zipcar and those types of things if you could focus in on battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell. And then one of the interesting ideas is a fuel cell vehicle as a power source. This might be interesting to cell phone companies or utilities for if power goes down, you could actually drive out the fuel cell vehicle, plug it in, use the hydrogen to power whatever is needed remotely. The hydrogen fueling market is providing hydrogen fuel to these vehicles. And so it's poised to be a fast-growing market if the numbers come out. So once we get these 68 stations in, at a certain point, you're going to reach a market tipping point where there'll be more and more stations needed. There aren't really any market leaders at this point. Everybody's kind of coming in slowly. So there are some first-mover opportunities. You can, high-profile branding and the potential for buyout from oil companies as the market takes off. So right now we're discussing on how to best incentivize early movers into this market. And so it's not something you would go in on your own. It's with state partnership. So I'm not going to go into the details of this slide, but why would you sell hydrogen? A typical gasoline fill, a retail station owner earns about $1 or $1.20 per fill up. A hydrogen fill would be closer to $4 or $5 per fill up, and so you have quite a bit more. You can take advantage of the efficiencies of the hydrogen car and the cost of the hydrogen and make a bigger profit. So that's one of the appealing things. There's a lot of possible configurations, and we can go into these, but this is a glass surface. So you can actually there's a pipeline. So the top 3 stations are actually pictures of existing stations in Los Angeles. The first one's a pipeline station. There's a pipeline of hydrogen that they just pull hydrogen off of. That's the cheapest way. The second one has a solar-powered electrolysis thing, so using electricity to make hydrogen out of water. And they also have delivered hydrogen. And then the third one is really interesting. It's taking the sewage gases from the Orange County Sanitation District and creating hydrogen from that. You can also create hydrogen on site with on-site natural gas reforming, or you can do a combined heat and hydrogen power type of an application. Another interesting thing is tapping into renewable energy. And so they have electrolysis systems available today where you could use electricity to split hydrogen off of water and create hydrogen that way. So in 2020, the state of California has a 33% renewable portfolio standard target. So if we have 33% renewables on our grid, there's actually going to be an excess electricity that doesn't have a place to go, enough to support a fleet of 1.2 million vehicles. So it's about 12,500 gigawatt hours of electricity spare. And so actually the next slide shows this. So this is a graph of springtime electric production. This is done by UC Irvine. So you can see at 10.8% penetration, those blue peaks on top are the wind. And then at 20.4% production, that wind starts to take off a little bit of the load following type of electricity. And at 33.5% production, those red peaks are places where electricity has no home. And so as we get into a more and more renewable-based grid, there's going to be more and more opportunities to take that electricity and put it to productive use. Components is another area that's wide open. One of the things that fuel marketers in California say, the people who actually sell gasoline fuel, is real estate is incredibly important. No dispensing system exists that has gasoline, diesel, natural gas, and hydrogen. If you could bring those together, you could save a tremendous amount of money and not take a precious real estate for fueling stations. Measurement and verification equipment, they're still working out how to measure and accurately pay for hydrogen. So you want to know you want to make sure you're getting the molecules that you pay for. And so that is something that's still under development. And the whole vehicle supply chain system is still in flux, and that's something Ichiro can talk about. So basically what is needed for success, we need stations, and so there's a plan for that, but we also need investors to get behind it. We need fuel cell vehicles and eager customers, and so that's actually me with a clarity. And then we need educated and supportive communities. So we're working on currently getting a plan to get a station in Santa Barbara here. So David and I are working together to educate officials and make sure that when the time comes in 2 or 3 years that the community is ready and it goes as seamlessly as possible. So just things to keep in mind, that fuel cell technology is becoming more and more off the shelf. Developers can focus on different configurations, and there's a variety of opportunity for revenue streams, and champions are needed to drive the market. So if we can all pull it off, it's better for everybody. Great.
Hi there. It's a real honor to be speaking in front of you as an MIT alum, and also being married to an MIT PhD. It's kind of a neat experience to be here. I've been to these events in the past, and so what I have done here is that I'm going to make a presentation that hopefully might be insightful to some of the entrepreneurs in the audience that could learn from some of the experiences that I've had as someone that works like an entrepreneur inside Volvo. My job there is mainly to explain to the executive management what is technologically possible and how we can make money with it, which is, entrepreneurial. So that's, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over some of the history of things that we have done in the past and where things are going. I'm afraid I can't tell, I'm speaking on my own behalf. I'm not speaking on behalf of Volvo, which is why I'm going to be showing things that are published by other car companies. Because if I show one from Volvo, I might get into trouble. So if you could go to the next slide, please. Back when I started at Caltech back in the 70s, this is how it looked like around Pasadena. And it wasn't very good. And as a result, the California Air Resources Board was looking for solutions to clean up the air. And the next slide shows something that they really latched on back then, which is the General Motors Impact, which is the predecessor to the EV1 that everyone must be aware of. Fortunately, one of the people that I went to school with at Caltech was a man named Alan Cocconi, who is actually the person that made the first drivetrain for the GM Impact. And as a lesson on sort of the technology, what he did was he actually soldered like 1,000 MOSFETs together to get the 100 kilowatt power out of this thing. So, that kind of, it was a totally different thinking. Instead of having just, like a 3, power transistors or something, he did it with thousands in parallel to get the power out. So that's what made this car possible. The California Air Resources Board obviously fell really in love with this, so they came up with this, what's called the ZEB mandate, as shown in the next slide. And what they did was kind of clever, and it's the kind of thing that a technology developer like myself really appreciates, and it's happening again, and this is kind of, now it's a phase 2 of this is happening, I guess you could say. But what you see here is that they essentially said what they wanted to have in 15 years. So they gave the technologists enough time to develop the thing. Now, obviously but one of the things they did is they tuned the rules to fit the image of what they had in mind based on the GM Impact, which was one problem. But anyway, this was the rule where they said, in 10 years, they want to have 2% of all cars to be electric vehicles and 10% of cars to be electric vehicles in 15 years. Next slide shows how Volvo was going to go and comply with this rule. And in our case, we have to be able to sell those cars, not just build them. We have to sell the darn things. And so we had to kind of figure out what the customers want. So we did some concept studies, as you can see here, on what customers would want in 2003. And we realized Volvo customers do not want short-range electric cars. They want to be able to go from Los Angeles to San Francisco and back and carrying their families. So we came up with this idea of what we call today plug-in hybrids. Back then, we just called them hybrids, by the way. And so that's the concept that we actually decided to develop. And the trouble is that the rules were not written to allow for that, and would not give us any ZEB credits for having something that has an internal combustion engine that will extend the range. So, so we had to lobby, talk to them, explain to them, and essentially the first, original thinking about a partial zero-emission vehicle, which I'm going to come back to later, was essentially being partially electric vehicle. But we're going to come back to that. The strategy Volvo set upon was to reach that 2003 product. We had, and also to satisfy the 1998 target for 2% cars, we had to have what's kind of an introduction vehicle, which was called the HEV 98. I'll show you a picture of. And in order to get that whole thinking about what these products are all about, and also to pretty much teach the whole company what this kind of vehicles are about, we had to develop a concept car, and that was in 1992. And next slide shows you this concept car, which was essentially the Volvo style of doing concept car is not just make something that looks pretty, although we do try to make it pretty. It gets into more magazines that way. But it's really there as a technology demonstrator to show people what we're trying to do. And it's actually to show our own company what we're trying to do a lot of times. And this is essentially the vision that we had of what that 2003 vehicle was going to be back in 1992. So we were projecting 11 years ahead when we built this car. And back then, Volvos are still square and boxy. This one is not. And this is one of the essential features of this type of car when we're only running on battery power most of the time and having a small range extender engine. This is a small generator that will allow you to recharge the battery as you went along. In this car, it was a gas turbine engine. It was something that at the time was like a fuel cell. It was a very unique technology that was being developed by various places. A company in Sweden was developing it at the same time. I think Allison was developing as well. We were talking to almost everyone in the world about that. Anyway, so this is the kind of car we did. And if you've ever been to our facility in Camarillo, that is the road that it's driving on where we're located. That is the building where we're in, except that the trees today are about 5 times taller than what's in the picture. Next slide, please. This would have been the product that we would have started selling in 1998. This is a prototype that was built in 1994 on the 850 model. As you can see, this is what Volvos looked like back then. They don't look like that today. And this car had a 3-cylinder engine to generate the electricity to charge the batteries if you want to go long distances. So this is something we built in 1994. Next slide, please. But what happened is that after we were all ready to go into 1990, start selling this in 1998. One of the things that started happening around 1998, and this is a data that was measured in 1999, is that air got really, really clean around that time. And as you can see here, even though the population and the economy grew by a significant amount between 1980 and 1999, the pollution levels dropped. And why is that? And this is an interesting thing that was a total unexpected thing. This was done without electric cars. This happened even though electric car mandate was created to reduce pollution, it happened without electric cars. Why is that? Next slide. It turns out that a technology that Volvo introduced in 1976 called the lambda sound, and this is another name for it is an oxygen sensor in your exhaust pipe. This technology is something that allowed the catalytic converter in your car to work more efficiently. And Volvo introduced this in 1976 to meet the earlier air resources requirement for lower emissions. And that was something that the big three were fighting at the time, back in the early 70s, that this can't be done. We've kind of by accident in the lab, we realized that by being able to measure this oxygen level, we could actually reduce the emission level quite significantly. And Volvo actually developed this ourselves. Just to give you a comparison on the alternative to an oxygen sensor, it turns out that being at Caltech, I get to talk to a lot of people at JPL, and one of the gentlemen there was a former assistant director of JPL. His name is Dwayne Dipree, and Dwayne at the time was developing hydrogen injection to piston engines, gasoline engines, to reduce emissions. Just think about that. And he has always credited Volvo for putting his research program, that program, out of business. Because, essentially we did it without using hydrogen. Kind of give you an idea how technology turns, isn't it? I thought that was kind of fascinating. But anyway, what happened is that essentially the car companies, including us and others, became very good at using this technology so that we were able to create something called the super low emission vehicles. And those became what's now known as PZEVs, partial zero emission vehicles. And if you were to introduce a PZEV vehicle that you could buy today and put it into a dirty air like Shanghai or Los Angeles back in the 70s, the gas is coming out of the tailpipe is cleaner than the air that's going into the engine. Literally, it's that clean. And in fact, to measure the emission levels on these cars, we had to actually put the car in a clean room. That's how amazing this is. Okay, next slide, please. Anyway, the result of that and the lobbying by the big three was that the 2% requirement went away, which meant that our HEP 98 never was produced. It wasn't going to make any money for us anyway, so that was fine. But we still had the 10% target that had to be satisfied with what's called advanced technology PZEV vehicles, just to kind of differentiate it from this emission control system type of vehicles that wanted to push technology. So advanced technology, that meant hybrids. Next slide, please. This is a Volvo hybrid that we built. It turns out the transmissions on the front-wheel drive Volvos that was introduced in the early 90s with the 850 model used transmissions supplied by Tyson in Japan. This is a really nice company. And we really like their front drive transmissions and for automatic transmissions, and we've been using that. And together we worked on what's called a power split hybrid transmission together with Tyson. It turns out that the Toyota developed their own hybrid transmission on a similar concept themselves. So it was an independent thing with, at the time, Toyota and Tyson were separate companies. Anyway, this was, so we had two cars that we started to experiment with in 1998. And next slide, please. Well, in 1999, Ford bought us. And one of the things they got was the hybrid transmission technology. And they put it in the Escape hybrid. There is proof that this is the case because they don't like us people to know about that, that they're using a Volvo technology in it. But if you were to go in the website and look for the first press release on the Escape hybrid, it mentions this. One of the things also that might be interesting to you to know about Ford is that the Escape hybrid does not have a Toyota technology in it. It turns out that Toyota did something smart when Ford started to do this, is that they got so concerned, they bought 51% of Tyson. So that's another interesting little twist in how technology turns, isn't it? So that now Ford had to negotiate with Toyota to use this technology. But anyway, I kind of digress. Just going back to the lithium-ion batteries, I think this is a very key technology, and I'm just going to try to focus on the rest of the talk on this because I think a lot of people here have heard about it, interested in it. In 1994, the outlook for batteries is shown in these tables. It's in a published paper that was published by my former boss, Bill Mason, and Urban Christensen, that is still working in Sweden. And USABC, this US Advanced Battery Consortium, had projected what the future, the ultimate battery are going to be, and they will have things like 200 watt-hour per kilogram, and you could get 400 watts per kilogram for 30 seconds. The chart you see on the right is something that Hitachi published recently, and it shows that they're working on 4 different kinds of lithium-ion batteries. And if you look at the chart, you could see that they already have something in the blue dot that's kind of labeled grid right now, but essentially the lithium-ion batteries are up, can be in the 200 watt-hour per kilogram range if you don't have to put too much power out of it. But if you want power, they have lithium-ion batteries just for that, which would be great for your strobe, by the way, for photography. That one is really impressive because that one is, today you could get 3,000 watts per kilogram. And you could see on the bottom table, they thought that the ultimate battery would be 400 watts per kilogram. Things that are totally, was not predicted back in 1994 is available. And also, you might also notice another thing about the 1994 table. It doesn't say anything about lithium-ion batteries. That's how, new lithium-ion batteries were. It was not known in 1994 when we were making that HEP 98. Okay, next slide, please. One of the other things about these things is I was talking about how many watts per kilogram and stuff. Well, weight is one thing. And a lot of times people start comparing the value of a technology based on what performance for the given weight. But for a car designer, for someone that actually has to execute the car, it's actually the size. The volume it takes up is very important. And I just did this on my own using CAD models that I happen to have available. And actually, in the case of the 1994, I did not have a CAD model. I had to actually scan a drawing and scale everything to size to show you that in 10 years, the size of the battery needed to move the car changed this much. And actually, the smaller car with the smaller battery actually has 50% more range. And the fact that the car is smaller because the battery is smaller allows you to have less power required for an electric motor. Just to kind of give you a glimpse of the scale, because this is kind of a PowerPoint representation. The car on the bottom is the first lithium-ion battery car built at Volvo. It's called the 3cc. I have one picture of it at the end of the presentation. And this was pretty much a way for us to learn how lithium-ion batteries degrade over time. So anyway, here is the actual battery module from that car. And this is how thick that is. That bar that you see on the bottom, that's how thick it is. And that car had 96 of these bricks, just to give you an idea. And at the time, there are no automotive lithium-ion batteries available. So, you could see I just welded up a lot of lithium, laptop batteries. And that's how we learned how these things degrade over time and how they heat up. So that's what that program was, if you want to take a look at it. As long as you don't take a picture of it, because there is something in here that I don't want people to see. Okay, next slide, please. Now, what's happening next, here I steal Toyota's slide, is that you can see that the performance of the batteries here are shown in terms of watt-hour per liter and watts per liter, no longer kilograms. And this is very important because partly because the size matters. You don't want to take up a lot of space. And you can see those dots shown there, showing essentially the state-of-the-art lithium-ion batteries. And then you could see that there are these clouds up there called all-solid batteries and metal air batteries that that's what Toyota is showing. And I could tell you that's pretty accurate. There are new technologies coming in those areas. And what's important here, as some of the more mathematically inclined people would notice, that this is a log-log chart. So what we're talking about is a 10-fold increase. Could happen in 10 years by switching from lithium-ion technology to the next battery technology. I cannot exactly tell you, the background for all-solid battery that Toyota has. I know for our research what that is, but I can't tell you that either, I'm afraid. But these things do exist. Toyota did actually do a demonstration run on an all-solid battery last year, which is why I know it exists. Metal air battery is being discussed pretty heavily up in the Bay Area, and I think IBM is actually one of the leaders in that technology. So there's a lot of interesting things up here to kind of compete with hydrogen fuel cells. And just to kind of end the things, I had to show you some pictures of some of the more recent cars that we did. This is a battery electric car. It's about the Nissan Leaf type of performance, but there's one unique thing about it. We're in Sweden. We had to make it run in the wintertime. So that's actually what makes this car unique. There are special things that we had to do to make sure that essentially the car will run at minus 30 Celsius. Just think about that. Okay, next slide. This is actually something that we're very proud of right now. This is a very upper-end car. This is a European-only model, and this is sort of issue about having been owned by Ford and no longer being owned by Ford. We could only offer this as a diesel plug-in hybrid. And the combined power on this thing is well over 400 horsepower. But it's also a plug-in hybrid, which means it could be driven without any fuel. So anyway, so those are two kind of things that we're doing right now. There are more things I can't talk to you about, but that I'm trying to give you some hints on. Next slide is a picture I took in Sweden at the Volvo Museum showing the 3cc in the foreground that I was personally responsible for, combined with the ECC, that's the plug-in hybrid car, that's the white car in the back. There is a battery electric car from the 70s in the background, that's the red thing. And the bus and the truck on either side of it are also plug-in hybrids that we played with back in the 1990s. And I'll kind of give you an idea of what kind of things that are possible, and also hopefully I gave you some insights on how, being an entrepreneur, things could go in a different way than you intend, and how regulations sometimes change, and sometimes for the good and sometimes for the bad. Okay, thank you very much.
So we're now at the Q&A session, and just to get things started, I have a technical question for anybody who wants to grab this. So if you got the hydrogen story, and then you get the electric story, and you were to plot the time frame for availability of a 150 to, let's say, a 200-mile range car, based on the current technology, and when do you think electric would get there, and when do you think, well, hydrogen seems like it's there already?
Okay. Yeah, just actually that's an easy one, because 200-mile electric cars are already here, thanks to Elon Musk. His cars could go 260 and maybe even further. So it's already here. The question is not so much when. It's like when it becomes affordable to normal people in large enough quantities. If I may expand a little
Please,
bit,
yeah.
That's a good segue for one of the points I forgot to make. Is the cars are not priced by the metal that's in the car. It's because each car has to amortize all the engineering costs that it's incurred in it, and that is incredible. I can't tell you the number, but I could just, it is a significant part of the car. And if you only sell a few number of cars, you have to amortize those investments over a few cars, which increases the price tremendously. And then the business model breaks down. That's the thing why the price has to come down, just because of price elasticity. It becomes unaffordable if it's just and not many cars will be sold. Anyway, that's
Thank you. Please.
Just three questions that have always kind of interested me about these. The first of which is, where are modular cars in all of this? Where is the car that you can only drive the front half of to work and back, but when you want to take your family, you attach it to the back end of the car? And I mean, this has been talked about forever, and I was scheming and dreaming on concept cars 50 years ago like that when I was a little kid. The second being, it seems as though to sell cars like this, you only have to have 10 of them, but they have to be big, nasty, muscly, and racy, and they have to make all kinds of records at drag strips, and they have to make a testosterone record, and after that the sales become academic. And I was just wondering what's being done, because I don't see that. And then the final item would be, it sure seems like when the first generation of Elon Musk cars become used cars, because the people have gone on, that those are going to be stupendous bargains. And I was wondering if there's an infrastructure for that yet, the used cool car.
I don't know how to answer.
I'll take a stab at the first one. The safety standards, I think, probably would jump out first as being one of the tough barriers to get over. The challenge of building a vehicle and getting it through the maze of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards for both occupant protection, but also the other side of crashworthiness. It's not an easy task. But once you get to that point of actually doing it, there comes the issue of products liability. And hidden in the cost of a vehicle is protecting yourself from being sued and attorneys. So there would be the question of how do you know what percentage of time the individual is driving with the other half of the vehicle not attached to it. It's a whole different crashworthiness experience. So while it sounds like something that you could get over easily, it's not trivial.
Well, the racing part is an easy one. Most cars are sold in emotion. So the people pay for performance or the promise of performance. So, and that's what we're trying to sell. Car companies are a consumer goods company. So it's really, we have to give what people want. And that's what's one of the things that are often forgotten, is that we're not a public, I don't know, we're not a public corporation. No, that's not quite right. We make things that people want to buy. And so that's why, we're more like a fashion company in that sense. That's where the performance stuff comes in. And then, what was the last one? Oh, yeah, used car. Yeah, I think that what you pointed out, I think that's going to be interesting. I would love to see what happens there, because there is residual value issues are still up in the air. Actually, I'm not a good person to talk to about residual values. There is a company, Santa Barbara, that works just on that. So I think they're the ones to ask. All right.
I think it's very important when you look at why people buy some of the Japanese makes today, and Detroit's certainly getting better at it, but there's a joy factor, I think, of when a car hits 100 and 120,000 miles. It still has some life into it, and you can give it to your child or daughter to drive to college, and you're not worried about them breaking down. Mm-hmm. We probably all know people that have had friends or even owned one yourself, but one of the early Priuses, when the batteries die before they were covered by warranty, if the battery dies, they're stuck with a $3,500 price tag to replace the battery, and the car's not worth that. So it's a different value proposition. I think you're going to start to see some of the same things happen probably with the early battery cars that we have today, with so much battery in the vehicle. And I think it gets to some of the questions that Aaron was talking about earlier, question Aaron answered earlier. It's not a question of technology. It's a question of just customer preference and what the market's going to absorb. I think, Aaron, to get to your question about 200 miles of range, I personally believe that in the next 10 to 15 years, people will start to realize that electric cars are never going to be nothing more than niche vehicles that people can drive 30 to 40 miles of range and be perfectly happy with living with them in a city environment. And when they need to go see somebody else up in San Francisco, they go to a different vehicle, either through a leasing operation or that would be just it. For instance, you call it an enterprise rental car, and they come to your house and drop off a vehicle that would be maybe a hydrogen fuel cell car that can take you the distance. So.
I've got 2 questions here. The first concerns electric vehicles or battery-powered vehicles. I've heard it referred to a couple of times, I can't remember which speaker, but as a zero-emission vehicle. And under normal conditions, an electric vehicle is charged at night, and our baseload power in this country is basically coal and nuclear. So don't you really have a coal-fired car as opposed to a zero-emission car, if that's the case? Yeah. Admittedly, the emissions may not be right there at your tailpipe, but the net emissions are still there, and that's something that I think a lot of people forget. The second point, and I'm not sure, again, who to direct this to, but it has to do with the hydrogen vehicle. Personally, I have a hard time imagining an infrastructure of hydrogen refueling stations anytime soon. This is a very complex, not just technically, but from an infrastructure standpoint. Why not, if you're going to use fuel cells, why not put a fuel processor on the front end of it and use natural gas? Is this something that is being considered, or in fact, even diesel for that matter? You could do it. I mean, it's not technically possible. Mm-hmm. So is that something that's being considered at all?
You want to take that? I don't know.
Well, onboard reforming has been looked at, methanol, natural gas, whatever you might want to throw in the tank and then combine it with a fuel cell. I think the majority of car companies, and they've even looked at combusting hydrogen inside the chamber itself, but most everybody has been there and done that and arrived at the point that it's just not the most efficient pathway. Mm-hmm. In terms of the infrastructure, I would challenge you to think that it really is a hurdle that's not able to get over. It will be expensive. There's going to be a lot of politics involved. But if you go back and read the history books of what Edison tried to do back in the early part of the last century of trying to get electric charging, there was a tremendous effort. It wasn't necessarily that was the thing that killed the electric car. So I think, frankly, the infrastructure issue is a little bit overblown.
There's there will be a methane or natural gas infrastructure before there will be hydrogen?
Well, if you would have asked me that 4 years ago, I would have said probably not, but everybody knows what's happening with the shale gal coming out of Pennsylvania, and yeah. The question of natural gas in transportation is very much an unknown right now. You're seeing a tremendous potential possibly unfolding with LNG in light-duty on-highway trucks. So far, Honda remains to be the only vehicle manufacturer that has a dedicated compressed natural gas car out there, but everybody's looking seriously at it. But again, it's a finite resource. It's not renewable. I think the people that are looking more towards the future are looking at hydrogen coming out of natural gas as getting that technology seeded and going towards the future. Again, as we heard tonight, being the Holy Grail.
And could I actually, real quick, Aaron, just on the infrastructure point, the National Academies of Science did a study in 2008, 2009, and they looked at the cost of transitioning to hydrogen. And it's about $50 billion to bring the whole country to hydrogen. And that breaks down as about $40 billion for the cost of vehicle buy down, so bringing the cost parity, and then the $8 billion for hydrogen infrastructure. And so when you put that in the context of other funding programs, it's really not that much, like considering that the corn ethanol industry was receiving $6 billion a year in subsidies. So it's not an insurmountable task. It's just we have to put the mind to it.
One thing.
Hold on.
I just want to add one thing. In the car company, one of the things that's happened in the last 10 years is that even the executives are starting to understand the concept of well-to-wheels CO2 emissions. And that is a big change, a fundamental change within the industry, so that they are able to understand that, when the electric cars make sense in a certain country and when it does not make sense in another country. So that's it's been interesting because that I watched it in my other previous when we were part of Ford, and that was kind of interesting.
Question in the back, and then the gentleman.
Well, I have a comment related to the onboard processing of fuels. Quickly, the bottom line was it wasn't economical. I mean, it comes down to that's why we don't pull up to an oil station and put oil in our tank and have an oil refinery in our trunk. It's just not economical. And they spent a lot of money in the 90s, AD Little and other companies, looking at onboard processing of fuels to deliver hydrogen to fuel cells. And the deal, we abandoned it because it just did not work. It's too expensive. It's just complicated. You're better off a centralized fuel processing like we do now. So that's the business model. And with hydrogen is the only fuel that the feedstock is going to get, the only fuel that actually will get less expensive, because the feedstock is not a limited resource. Yes, so you look at all the other fuels, they have limited resources. And you look at corn, or just using biofuels, the cost of biofuels have gone up because of drought conditions. So it doesn't make sense to use arable land to grow fuel. That does not work. So the hydrogen, and also with natural gas, it actually, because the fuel cell is so efficient, it's more efficient to actually take the natural gas, reform it, produce a hydrogen stream, deliver it to the fuel cell, than it is to take hydrogen and burn it in an internal combustion engine. That was my point. Yes. So it's actually, the fuel cell is so efficient, you're better off taking a stream of a feedstock, producing a hydrogen stream, delivering it to the fuel cell, let the fuel cell do the work, and then power your drivetrain. Yeah. That was my point. Whether the reformer of the natural gas is on the vehicle or in central station. It's a economies of scale. You're better off doing it on a central location. Yeah.
I've always heard that the momentum of a car stopping frequently, the amount of energy that goes into the braking system, that's a very significant consideration. I was wondering if capturing that energy works better in a battery scenario or a hydrogen fuel cell scenario.
It's mainly in the batteries. Even hydrogen fuel cell vehicles have a battery in it, and that's one thing, and that's mainly to recover that. I think, how big is the one in the Clary? It's fairly big, isn't it? They won't tell us, but it's around 40 to 43 kilowatts. It's essentially the size of the fuels. The battery in a plug-in hybrid is maybe twice as big as that, so it's not. It's fairly large. Yeah. So that's how it's done. Yes. So that's why the battery is needed, even in hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. Right.
What's the longevity of the hydrogen fuel cell? How many miles? Or hours?
If I knew that, I'd probably be in a better position to answer it. But it is still I guess the biggest challenge that the industry is working on right now is just the long-range durability. But they're successful in cold weather. They're successful in hot weather. Upwards of what you're seeing today in the 150,000 miles of range. Translate that to years, you're talking 10, 15 years. The goal is to make the vehicle as transparent as driving a Toyota Camry or a Ford Focus or a Honda Accord. They'll have to meet the same warranty standards. It's 100,000 or 150,000 miles, 10 or 15 years of life. And as Ichiro was saying, that's part of the gamble and the risk is a lot of people don't understand that recalls and warranty costs have to be absorbed in the majority of cases by factories, and those people have to meet a profit margin and deadline for the board members just as anybody else. And if they have to absorb high warranty costs, the vehicle may not go into production. So.
And this is not just for the car company, what he's talking about. It's actually for the fuel providers as well. The thing about hydrogen fuel cells is that you could poison it with impurities. And then you start pointing fingers. Who was at fault? And that's one of the things that really scares us. And the nice thing about an internal combustion engine, why it's been so successful, is that it's very tolerant to things, bad fuels. But the hydrogen fuel, is not. Just keep that in mind.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, Ichiro. It wasn't until the mid-1980s when the emission standards were getting very, very stringent, both federally and in the state of California, that it was the first time in the history of this country that engines and fuels they started to be treated just as a systems approach. It's just like the human body. If you eat garbage food, you don't have a long life. But the fuel quality and lubricants and fuel additive packages in the 70s and 80s were not nearly up to speed of what was needed for combustion optimization, but also maintaining the life of the after-treatment devices, namely the catalytic converter. So we're almost at the same point we were back in the 70s, I guess, with hydrogen fuel quality as we were back in terms of gasoline. Oil companies talking to the car companies.
When T. Boone Pickens was making a lot of noise about wind and then found out he couldn't get federal subsidies for infrastructure and shut up, did anyone ever try to factor in the wind cycle for Midwestern wind plants, which of course have huge capacity, for production of hydrogen fuel, and allow the wind infrastructure amortization cost to be balanced off against automotive fuels instead of baseload electricity, which I would think would have changed the argument, but I've never run the numbers myself.
Yes, the biggest wind experiment that I know of is they actually did in Palm Springs. They did a wind to hydrogen, and that went into a bus system there. And then InRail in Colorado has that as well. And so right now the big issue is there aren't very many cars out to buy the fuel. And so as the demand grows, I think you'll start to see a lot more business models starting to pull that in.
But does the economics of that improve wind's viability over replacement of baseload electricity?
Yeah, so the profit margin potential on hydrogen, depending on how far you have to transport it and stuff, is quite high.
Yeah, there is something similar to that in Norway, where it's hydroelectric that's creating the hydrogen, and which is kind of interesting that because they're so environmentally conscious, they don't want to use the natural gas to make the hydrogen. They use the hydro, but I could also, my little shopping spree. I went surveying there. They are getting. It is a very profitable operation. The production of hydrogen for vehicles using hydropower was a very profitable operation, which kind of says something,
Question for Ichiro?
Yes.
I believe. You, at the end of your presentation, touched on batteries.
Yes.
And visioning for batteries that have more density and potentially could compete with hydrogen. One of the big issues with batteries is the ability to get it charged quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, hydrogen's a 3-minute charge compared to multiple hours. Is there anything that you're seeing, or is there any visioning you can do pertaining to batteries and breakthrough in terms of charging times?
Okay. Yeah. The power. When I talked about watts per kilogram, there are some batteries that are very good at power. Those are also very good at charging. It's actually related. The physics is related. Also, just as a caution as well, the physics is such that if you were to refuel a hydrogen bottle fast, you don't get as much range out of them, believe it or not. You get more heating. So just kind of keep that in mind. So you actually, to get the most range out of a hydrogen tank, you want to charge it, refill it slower. It is still faster than hours of electricity, but then you have things like actually the larger the battery, the more range you could put in faster. Also, that's another interesting thing. And so, so like a Tesla Model S, you could put in 100 miles of range in it much more quickly than trying to put 100 miles of range into a Nissan Leaf. It's kind of an interesting little thing.
We're still talking hours of charging?
I think almost like 30 minutes, I think, is what Tesla is shooting for, I think. Yeah, I think something like that, is it?
For 100 miles?
Yeah, yeah.
I think
Yeah, I think so, yeah, something like that. It's, yeah, that, so.
How many cycles, 30-minute charging cycles, how many cycles can the battery pack put up with before you see a degradation?
Well, in that
output?
case, it's not doing, it's on a Tesla, we're talking about a fraction of the capacity. That's the thing is that the larger the battery, the more, of those kind of things you could take up. That's the interesting thing. When people talk about cycles, this is another little interesting misconception that I think is getting propagated. People are measuring cycles in different ways. If you were to take this battery and do 100% charge-discharge, it doesn't live very long. If you do a 50%, it will live 10 times longer. If you're doing like, how a typical person, that's commuting short distances drives a Nissan Leaf, they're recharging 20% of its capacity. Going from work, home to work, plug in, that could go forever. Essentially, that's the thing that's getting misunderstood. It's not the absolute number; it's how intense the number are.
So you're saying Tesla's oversizing the battery pack for the average driving
Yeah,
range?
that's what I think is we're going to discover. And actually, so that's where Tesla, putting such a big battery actually helps them make the battery live longer. You see, it's interesting, isn't it? You pay more and it lives longer. Well, that makes sense, I guess.
I have a question. Anybody else before me? Okay. So Tyson, you spoke a little bit about opportunities, entrepreneurial opportunities, and it was predominantly around in the service space. From a technological perspective, given all the things that we've heard today about the hydrogen vehicle, electric, perhaps even natural gas, what are some of the needs from the technical community that would lead you to the goals that you're looking for? Anybody can jump on that one.
Well, I don't know, tanks is one thing I'm most concerned about. I think I've already shared my concerns about hydrogen tanks with Tyson. It is it's a lot of pressure. And it's unbelievably high pressure when we start talking about 10,000 PSIs. To give you a comparison, a CNG tank normally is what? 300, 300, right? No, 330. So it's 3 times the energy is going to be contained in there. So that's, anything break, a failure. It's a single point failure. Anything goes, it fails. There's no backup.
So materials research, is there
Yes.
anything? So would you talk a little bit about the kinds of materials that people are looking at?
Not so much materials, but the quality and the repeatability of the manufacture.
Okay.
Because it only takes one defect in one tank, and your company's going to go bust. Mm-hmm. And that's what scares us. And so what happens is when you buy a hydrogen tank of this sort, you pay a lot of money for it because they do a lot of testing on it. They take X-rays. They do microscopic testing. They do make sure that tank is perfect. If it has a flaw and if it fails, people are going to die. They know that. So that's one thing that, as a car company, as a Volvo safety car company, it's a big concern for us.
But all that testing adds cost.
Exactly, and then it becomes hard to sell. So that's what's happening right now.
How about supercapacitors?
There's place for them too. Yeah, there are places for it.
We'd ask for the mic, but we're right here.
Yeah.
Yeah, the question was what about supercapacitors? And there's one of the things I wanted to tell you is that you could see that our friends at Hitachi are making 4 different kinds of lithium-ion batteries for 4 different applications. And there are, one of the things is as a technologist, you might, a technology geek like myself, is that if you have 4 different flavors, you could start blending them to do something totally different. So it's not 4 different applications. It's like 16 different applications. You just have to find it. That's exciting. And ultracapacitor adds another flavor. You could combine that with batteries and you get 25 flavors. Wouldn't that be fascinating? The thing is that, that's the kind of job I do. I'm trying to find all those different combinations. And and if people come up with new ones, let me know, because I really love to talk to you.
We have time for one more question.
Okay, well, Tyson, do you want to respond to some of the things about the tank?
Go for it.
tankage? Well, I just want to, Ichiro, I've been involved in hydrogen for over 20 years now, and I've gone to closed-door meetings with automakers, and not literally in 20 years, I have not heard the concerns of storage tanks that I heard from you tonight.
Okay.
Literally have not heard those.
That is.
I'm only, no, the Honda I have outside is carrying at any time the equivalent of 4 gallons of gasoline energy content.
Yes.
The tank is the safest part of that car.
It's
And,
not.
and it is the safe, and I can safely say, it is relatively the safest car in the parking lot wherever I am.
I am totally sure that one has passed all its tests on the hydrogen tank quality. It's when we start talking about thousands of cars, and you get one bad tank. That's what what we're concerned about right now. And the
Even if it ruptures, what would happen? You'd have a release of 4 gallons
okay, no, we're not talking about the release of the hydrogen combustion is not what I'm concerned about. It's the pressure. It's an explosion. If you were to this is actually something that we are concerned about in terms of any type of laboratories where you work with pressure equipment. Anytime you start talking about over 100 psi, safety precautions has to be made because the shrapnel and all the other things that happen is very. Okay. My concern is not by my own. I would have to refer you to a document that I've actually, I've sent it to you too. It was the Japanese SAE conference roadmap for hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, and they have a working group on tank development, and they talk about safety.
Does anyone scuba dive here? Thousands of people scuba dive around the world.
Yeah.
And you have on your back a steel tank
How-
at 2,300 psi.
Yeah,
James, just
that's why it's steel. Yeah. No, it is fair enough. Yes, you're totally right. We're just talking about trying to make it light. That's what it comes down to.
James, you and Ichiro need to hook up afterwards. but
Yeah,
I-
it's okay. I know.
An interesting point, I think, to consider from the entrepreneurial standpoint, 30,000-foot level, again, talking about the seamless experience of getting into new technology. Just anecdotally, one of the things I know that Honda's experienced with their CNG dedicated Civic, it's not necessarily that the car has extremely low emissions or they're proud of getting into the HOV lane, which is convenient for them. The response has been, what's the best part of driving the car is they don't have to go to a gas station again. They can fuel at home if they've got a home refueling station. So I think when you look at that opportunity from electric vehicles or even hydrogen vehicles to try to find that type of a pathway for different types of onboard storage, but also the general overall experience of refueling the vehicle at a residential location probably is where you could see some real opportunity for an entrepreneurial exercise.
It appears that the train has actually left the station, and we are unfortunately out of time. I would hate to do this, but go ahead.
Just a quick one. How's BMW done with the liquid hydrogen? Is there
I think
information you guys
they've,
have?
I can't speak for them, but I think they've abandoned it. Yeah, it's not going to happen.
Very much for, I thought, an incredibly illuminating and explosive conversation. And anybody who wants to meet most of these gentlemen, I know one has to leave. You going to be available for a few moments? Yeah. Okay. So appreciate your time, and next time.